Hello, in this video I want to finish up the series that we've been doing with settler colonialism in space. This has been a really long series, but I really want to be able to talk about settler colonialism in a bunch of different facets and be able to talk about it in like all the context in which I think you'll see it on this resolution, because I feel like that was just the best way for me to really do my due diligence, considering that I really do think that it'll be a core criticism for the resolution that's upcoming, and I think that it's something that if you're really not prepared for, it can catch you off guard and put you in a really tough position. And so I think being able to just at least have this on your mind, or something that you've like seen as important just because of the fact that you've seen me put so many videos on it, could hopefully kind of get your mind stirring and help you think about the ways in which this criticism is like really relevant to the resolution as a whole. In this video I want to continue and finish the series that we've been kind of doing with like critical responses to settler colonialism when it's read as a negative strategy versus critical affirmatives. I think that this strategy is really good against a lot of critical affirmatives, because the ones that are really based in futurism, the ones that are really based on a different operation of outer space as a whole, I think have a lot to kind of like learn in terms of like their ideas for how they in terms of like how their ideas are connected to like settler colonialism, the erasure of settler colonialism, and just the continuation of the idea of like being able to clear land, create unending resources, etc. All is really important kind of like framings for how you're able to think about like the terms of the resolution as a whole. And I think that in this video I'm able to really kind of get into the nitty-gritty of the link debate, the permutation debate, the impact comparison, alternative debates, in order to give you like a really nice finish off to this series and a way for you kind of like understand like how critical teams should be kind of like processing these ideas so that you could defend against this criticism thoroughly. I think that in the context of the link debate, a lot of the arguments that you want to make is that the kind of like arguments that they're kind of like situating, we can kind of talk about the main two that we were kind of discussing when I was talking about how to read this as a strategy versus critical teams. The first one being the idea of like space not only as resource, but space as the clearing of land and the creation and ability to found new land in order to kind of like cleanse human society from its relationship to like settler colonial violence as a whole. I think that this is like one of the things that will be like the most common used link argument against like so many of teams that are reading arguments about futurism, teams that are reading arguments about space communism and stuff like that, because I think that there are so many ways in which their kind of like idea of being able to think about space as a place to kind of like fix the violences that are created on Earth is founded and used as like a paradigm that often kind of like holds back a lot of like really interesting kind of like perspectives in terms of like how we should be relating to space in the first place. And I think that the response that you really need to be having, not only from kind of like what we've talked about in terms of how you should be reframing and writing like a lot of the stuff in the 1AC, but I guess once you get to this like particular link argument where you're trying to answer it later on, is that I think the best way to kind of like respond to these arguments is like once again like setting up a lot of that uniqueness question that we talked about in the thesis debate, that like obviously like the 1AC's kind of like resourcification is different than the paradigm that is currently used in like white cis heterocapitalist patriarchal society, that there's kind of an inevitable like desire to go to space because of the way in which like people like Elon Musk, NASA and his relationship to private investors, etc., have all kind of like made it already their mission to be able to gain access to this particular set of resources. And so it's really an inevitable question in terms of how we're able to position our response to that, and being able to make arguments about like why the kind of like capabilities that we're able to see from like basically refusing to have those debates will kind of create the worst forms of impacts and instead of like the best ones. I think that being able to make arguments about like how ceding space to like privatize means and ceding space to just like the right or like to hyper-capitalists in general makes things a lot worse and kind of like fast forwards and accelerates the process of settler colonialism and destroys our relationship to Earth, and making arguments about how that kind of like overwhelms the necessity of like having to have like a thorough responses could be like really good in terms of like winning why, like along with the framing that we were kind of talking about with like material tactics in the last video, is kind of like a better way to think about like solvency in the context of that question. I then think that when you kind of like move over to like maybe some of the secondary link arguments about like subject formation and stuff as a whole, a lot of the arguments that people are making in the context of subject formation, a lot of the stuff that I think that you should be saying there is that the question of like how we're able to think about subjects in the context of space doesn't always require the instantiation of a post-human or something beyond the human. That sometimes the way in which we're able to think about some of these like foreign spaces and the way that we relate to them is by the process of undoing instead of like the idea of going beyond. That the idea that's usually indicted in a lot of these like settler colonial kind of like studies or indicts of like just the post-human as a whole are about the idea of being able to move beyond the capabilities of the human and transcend it, which often causes like the erasure and the continuation of settler colonial violence under a new name. But I think that the kind of destructive process, the undoing and refusal of being able to name this human in order to find like alternative life, could be a really interesting way for you to like find a different way to kind of like frame the response to humanity, and like why it's kind of like a necessary component to being able to tune in to radical alternatives to like life that are often like not forward or given by the context of the choices available under civil society. I then think that when you move on to places like the permutation debate, a lot of the things that you really need to do is have like example based debates that kind of like show how the tactics that you're able to take up fulfill that framework and are able to give you the permutation basis. Just like I say for other teams where I would say that the framework of the debate is super important for how you're able to win the permutation, how you're able to beat the permutation. It's also super important for your ability to win the permutation, because if you're able to show that the kind of like framework allows for you to kind of like meet a checklist for you to gain access to the permutation based off of the type of competition that you want to have, whether it be in the context of like material tactics or just like the idea of kind of undoing the human, etc., and other questions like that is really relevant, that I think that you're able to win, that there are instantiations of like what the net benefits of the permutation could be, which I think are really important for you to be able to like bring about not just questions of whether or not the alternative is mutually exclusive with the app, which although relevant is not always the most convincing way to make a permutation work, and then you're able to kind of create more nuanced ways that like bring up like material examples, instantiation of tactics and stuff like that that are useful in the context of the alternative, and then the affirmatives process like feels a lot more endemic to the ideas that are kind of being offered by the negative team as a whole and just the criticism, and I think that it makes the affirmative just a lot stronger and puts them in a lot stronger position. I then think that when you start transitioning into the impact comparison alternative portion of the debate, a lot of the advice that I would be giving, especially in the context of like of like how you should be debating against the alternative, is forcing it to kind of like be having to answer a lot of the uniqueness questions that we were giving earlier on for this other link debate, really pressing the alternative and asking the question of how it responds to like hyperacceleration in the context of space and what that does to like change the nature of capitalism, how it's able to, even if it refuses like the idea of going out to space, check other entities and stuff like that, can be really interesting places for you to be able to place solvency thresholds on an alternative that either require the negative team to spend a lot more time explaining it and thus give them less time to really explain some of these more other points of offense that could be more damning to the affirmative, and put them on the defensive in terms of being able to like explain like why their alternative or methodology is able to do something generative, just because you have like so much arguments to kind of like offer in terms of why it's such a pressing concern about like the alternative uses of space and what those things can be doing to kind of like make worse the terms that we're kind of like already having in terms of our relationship to space, and how we should kind of be relating it to it not just as a resource but as a concept for us to kind of like think about in terms of like what humanity's relationship to like other like sources of just like human life and other like ideas in general will be. And I think that being able to frame that question as like really pertinent to how the alternative is able to resolve a lot of the questions that it's raising of the affirmative is really helpful in terms of just guiding your offense as a whole, and hopefully a way for you to kind of like start off thinking about the basis for a lot of your offense against a criticism like this. Hopefully you've tuned into the series or enjoyed it at some level and been able to like learn stuff from it, and hopefully you'll tune into other stuff that I'll be talking about with space privatization, different LD skills, and other stuff that I'll be doing on this channel. And yeah, thank you as always for watching.